Three, two, one. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Inside Movies Galore. I'm your host, David Streggy, but I am turning this ghoulish film that we are doing tonight over to Dane. So why don't you tell us what we have in store for the lovely ladies and gentlemen out there tonight?
Well, lovely ladies and gents, tonight's movie is Monster Squad from 1987. And it was, interestingly enough, co written by Shane Black on top of being directed by whatever his name is.
Fred Dekker.
Fred Dekker. Yep.
Dracula.
Yep, and the synopsis is a young group of monster fanatics attempt to save their hometown from Count Dracula and his monsters. Pretty straightforward and tells you exactly what it's about.
Well, you
and
could
yeah.
put it another way too. It's basically the Goonies fight the Universal monsters.
So I've heard people say. I like this a whole lot better than the Goonies, though.
Well, yeah.
But here's okay. So first of all, obviously spoilers everywhere. And I had never actually seen this movie before tonight. It was one that I had always wanted to see because I heard so many great things about it. And I wanted to host because I have seen a lot, all of the great, old school Universal monster films, and those are some of my favorites from childhood. So I could, relate to these characters here, and just for my first impressions, overall it was, very faithful to the lore of those creatures. Without obviously they can't, because it's TriStar, they couldn't use the exact likeness of the Universal monsters, but they did a good job with recreating as much as they could. But that's a decent place to set some kind of foundation, but let us hear from some other people about what they thought. Let's hear what Jake thought.
I'll be honest. This is a movie that I'm not sure what my history is with it. I feel like I saw probably bits and pieces of it when I was a kid. I probably did see in whole or in part in the early '90s or even earlier, but I have no clear memory. I feel like Brandon put this on a couple of years ago for Halloween because it looked really familiar, and I feel like maybe that was why, but I don't remember for sure, and I forgot to ask him. So this is the one time I know for certain that I've watched it, but I don't think it's the first time. And I do have some grounding in those old Universal movies. I have seen Dracula and Frankenstein, and not to mention the old Abbott and Costello monster movies were a big part for me when I was a kid. So there's a little bit of the stuff they built on to deal with there.
Mm-hmm. Katie, do you concur?
Yes. And for me, this was not a first time watch. It was my pick actually. So, but I did not see it as a kid. I was a Goonies kid. I saw the Goonies. So it's like, seems like a lot of people is like one or the other. And I was not a Monster Squad kid, sadly. But my daughter is a Squad kid. I believe we showed her this before we showed her the Goonies, if I'm not mistaken. So that was actually my first introduction to the film, was when I was showing my daughter. And she liked it. And she didn't really have a big frame of reference for the Universal monsters. So even without that, she still enjoyed the movie. And I think she had some sort of general understanding. It seems that these characters are kind of just in our general understanding of folklore, as at least as Americans. So
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so she had that going in, which was good. But overall, I think it's a really fun movie. It's some great classic, like late 80s, almost early 90s. Some of it feels like, I feel like it was a bit ahead of its time. But yeah, it was I thought a great pick for this month. So I'm glad it got voted in.
Absolutely. Dustin?
Oh yeah, I love this movie. Like, it's just so great. I first saw it. I think, about 2/3 of it. Excuse me. About 2/3 of it when I was like, I want to say 10, 11, something like that. Like, it was on TV one day, and I missed like the first 20, 30 minutes or so. But I remember it was like, wow, this is awesome. What is this? And I didn't know it was called the Monster Squad until a few years later. And I didn't necessarily grow up with it like a lot of people do. Like, if you go to, if you look at a lot of like interviews, or just hear like people that work in horror, like directors, actors, like a lot of them love this movie, and it's pretty easy to see why, especially if you saw it, as a kid in the '80s. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I mean, I have like just nothing but love for this movie.
Yeah, it's well, it
So
is
good.
funny that like, well, because I didn't grow up with this or the Goonies, or a lot of those like kind of childhood milestone live action films. I'm not talking about animation, but from that generation, I didn't grow up with them, but I did grow up like the kids in the movie. I did grow up with the actual old school monster films from Universal from the classic period. So I think that's kind of an interesting parallel there. But David, first impressions?
Well, I first saw this probably early '90s, and I saw bits and pieces of it in the early '90s, and then, of course, I think TNT actually put it on a couple of times then. But I actually went and picked this up maybe 20, maybe 15 years ago. So it is a classic in my mind because of how old it is. I like the concept of a club. I really do because when boys get together when they're very young, it's something to do, especially for the oddball people,
Yeah, which
the
that
outsider.
yeah, and that's this I guess kind of transitions a little bit into we can kind of probably get through characters pretty fast just because they're rather archetypical of this kind of film in this time period. But just to start off, one thing that I noticed was that you can definitely tell when this was made in terms of like you have the kids on their bikes unsupervised with the flashlights going to look for monsters, and you always have the little ones who want to tag along, and the older kid who's, about to enter high school and is starting to get too old for this kind of stuff, but is still not quite there yet. And, you have to have the tough kid, the fat kid, the little girl, or in this, or the teenage girl that doesn't fit, all those standard archetypes there. Um, but, you can definitely tell that it's a product of its time. But, yeah, the characters themselves are not really all that deep, and they're not really meant to be. But anybody agree, disagree with that?
Yeah, I
Probably.
think in terms of that kind of club atmosphere, that it reminds me a lot too of like Little Rascals.
Hmm.
It's that same kind of idea, and I think they do a great job in this one of kind of nailing those archetypical characters. But I also noticed, watching it, and watching it the first time through, even as a mom, kind of like screening it for my kid a little bit. Well, she was watching it with me, so I guess I wasn't screening that well, but just noticing some of the language, like still very 80s with some of the things that they say,
Oh
and
yeah.
ways that they, like the fat kid, like, oh, kid,
You
my
just
name
call
is
him.
Horace.
Yeah, well,
My
there's
name is
that is interesting you bring that up because not only is it some of the things that don't quite, I mean, to a certain degree they're kind of universal as far as like boys doing what boys do, and doing things with other boys, that'll never age. But like the and the homophobic slurs, and the fact
right.
that the women don't really have a place in that world, which again, it's kind of fitting for that age group, that often happens. But nonetheless, it's one of those things that you can definitely tell that it's a product of when it was made, and plus the adults that are writing it have to be at least 30, and so what does that mean? They're most likely, born in like the 50s or something. So that's kind of why I think you see a lot of those kinds of relationships occurring in
Yeah, like
from
their memories
like
of being a kid in like the 60s and 70s
Right.
translates to it.
well, and that's why I think when you see all these movies that uh were written by people in the 80s and then they come out now and things are so different, there people are trying to have more gender equality and more just recognition of other people's perspectives and stuff. And I think that's why, to a certain degree, that people who grew up on, for example, 80s movies are perhaps a bit unsure of how to take that new reality because, the ball keeps bouncing from generations past, but, it definitely does fit the time period because, well, it was of its time, but that's
And
one aspect that doesn't age well.
Yeah. Well, it feels really
that's
authentic. Like just the way the kids relate to each other.
well,
Well,
Go
what's
on.
interesting is when
Go
people
ahead,
and I
Katie.
kind of I to move down from that thought
What's
where
oh,
you're talking about people kind of reflecting that out. I think the way, like, I be quite a bit, and I think there's kind of another side of that coin, whereas some of the people who have a hard time with the new language and equality and way we look at things, I almost look at it as a little bit of for having to be quite so careful. Like, I like the being able to be a little bit ridiculous in a way that isn't politically correct, because a lot of times that's very funny. And I think we've lost a lot of that today in, even just, and for good reason. But it's like getting a cat that's already declawed. I get to reap the benefits of having a declawed cat without having to do the bad. Kind of that same idea. I get to sort of enjoy a certain time, and it makes it like All in the Family with Archie Bunker. It's never fly today, but it's fun to enjoy something, a product of its time.
Yeah, well, it's
yeah.
I mean, that's inevitably what I think happens because unfortunately, nuance is not really something that we get a lot of anymore. To where if the pendulum's going to swing one way, it's going to swing all that way, and then if it's going to swing the other way, it's going to swing all that other way. And
Right.
so, you would get people from times of old that thought it was okay to say anything that they wanted about anybody, and then now the pendulum swung the other way to where even just the implication of something that was said in the wrong way or to the wrong person or whatever, um, you know there are going to be people holding you to task, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that oftentimes they get a little trigger happy nowadays, but again, that does tell you kind of where we were at versus where we're at now.
And I'll
Oh,
admit,
and go
of
ahead, Jake.
there were a couple things that were said that I kind of cringed a little bit when I heard them, a couple words. But they're also generally the kids were a little. I think they got away with language that kids wouldn't necessarily get away with in a modern film.
Well, modern film, quite possibly, yeah. Modern society, I'm sure that they say a whole lot worse to each
Right.
other, but
Like
in
one part I liked was like when the little girl called them all chicken shit.
yeah, that was nice.
But another thing, you're talking about nuance. One area where there was no nuance, which very much shows the film as a product of its time, was the whole idea of the adults as idiots, especially that cop's partner. Like, I mean,
Hey,
geez, they made
he
the
was
cops.
cool.
Yeah, but they made the cops in last week's movie almost look half competent. Almost. And I know those cops were definitely a reference to this specific type of presentation because again, it's like the whole idea of the kids have all the answers, the adults are clueless, And that definitely was a big thing in the mid late 80s, definitely.
Well, and in the 90s too with kids movies. I mean, I think that's kind of a trope in a lot of children's films, is that the adults never believe the kids and all that stuff. And
Well,
I mean,
and
Yeah, and that's part of the fun too. Um, like these cops were at least somewhat serious. So I'm not really sure where you're getting. Aside from crazy partner,
Well,
just
the
telling
fun thing
all the jokes. I don't see where you're getting it. Like I don't.
How
sports,
many times did the
It's not
one
there.
say, and I'm really a good cop?
yeah.
yeah, I mean, he was a little bit over the top, but I think what we're trying to get at is that in the last film we watched, Killer Rack, that those police officers were, well, they were in a much more deliberately absurdist world, to be fair, but they felt like they were two idiots who were trying their very best to be competent, and one of them was not that much smarter than the other, but they behaved in such a way that they didn't know that they were dumb, or they weren't too over the top about it, which is a little bit more akin to the way that, people who are not very smart, they tend to not know that they're not very smart. And so therefore
Yeah.
then they tend to behave as though they are very smart. And it's just the fact that they happen to not know anything. So I think that that's kind of what we're getting at. But this guy does feel just a little bit out of place, the partner, in terms of his overall delivery and everything. But
He was like Eddie Murphy. It's like
trying
Eddie
to
Murphy was in the movie.
trying to be, but not
Well,
succeeding.
Eddie Murphy usually doesn't play idiots. So he usually plays over the top, but
Yeah,
I'm wondering, did anyone pick up on the fact that quite possibly the entire movie sort of past the point where we see our main boy, I forget his name, but it's clear that his parents are like going through a divorce, and he seems to kind of retreat into monsters as a way to kind of cope with like his parents not getting along or whatever.
Nailed it.
And
Exactly.
there's a point where it seems like he could be writing the story.
Mhm.
Is the rest of the movie from his perspective as if he were writing this story, and then does that sort of explain some of the absurd nature of some of these relationships and way that like the cops, for example, like as if it were being told from a child's perspective?
that's a fun
that's an
thought.
interesting point.
I hadn't
I
thought about
mean,
that. Yeah.
well, I mean,
Hmm.
that kind of goes into the this is it's not done in the exact same way as something like, say, E.T., but like you have movies like E.T., The Iron Giant, other children's films or films about children that have something fantastical about them. Oftentimes, whatever the fantastical thing is, it's often a metaphor for a child growing up and trying to differentiate and trying to navigate some kind of difficult family situation. Most famously was E.T. because Steven Spielberg was a child of divorce, and so therefore, finding a friend that wouldn't go away, or would transcend that kind of stuff, is what ET was all about. So in this case, you could say that regressing into a childlike state and into a um, state of making these kind of fantastical creatures real, um, and having a club and doing like kind of traditionally childlike things, even though he's like middle school age and is probably, that perhaps is not necessarily his initial instinct, but yeah,
Well,
you
that's a
could definitely,
very tender age, that middle
yeah,
school. You're kind of in between. You're not a kid anymore, but you're not quite a teenager, and you're hovering
Hmm.
right in that adolescent area. I should know, I have one.
yeah. Well, and you have the tough guy kid who wears the leather jacket and all that stuff, and
Yeah, and I got the impression he was definitely like at least a little bit older. Like he was like
yeah.
Yeah.
maybe 15 or 6. Well, maybe
Well,
not
and
16, but 15.
he's clearly in a much more precarious position on that level, but he, has enough of that escapist drive to want to go along with this. On
He
top
also
of just
seems like the whole experience kicks his ass too by the end of the movie. I might
yeah.
add.
Well, and I do think that's a definitely a good thematic reading of the film that I think well, not a lot of people would necessarily pick up on the first time, but I think it's definitely there, and I mean that does fit in with a lot of those middle school children coming of age kind of movies that the 80s tended to specialize in. Um, a more realistic example is something like Stand By Me, which nothing supernatural happens in that, but that's one of like the prototypical films of that type from that period. Anything more about characterization before we get to plot? Because this is
Well, there.
more of a plot driven film.
There. Did you guys notice there were some moments of like? Well, we've kind of already touched on it a lot, but there were some moments of like deeper character depth that were more alluded to than like explicitly stated.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the ones that we've already touched on are like the parents' divorce, like subplot. Um, but one thing that always kind of sticks out to me when I watch this is the scene where they finally go and talk to scary German guy,
Mm.
and like they find out, oh, he's actually great. And there's just like a little moment where when they're leaving his house, it's like, wow, you know a lot about monsters. I suppose I do. And as he's closing the door, like you can see like his like
Yeah.
concentration camp number.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, oh wow.
Well, and yeah, and keep in mind again is um, you have a lot of films in the 80s that are really treasured. Again, generally speaking, people that wrote them grew up in, say, the 50s, 60s, maybe even the 40s, depending on how old they are. So, like, that's generally the window of reference that we're talking about when we talk about those kind of films. Plus, the fact that people who did survive World War II or the Holocaust or those different that time period that they would have still been alive and but it's just again that's something that if you would have said oh crazy German guy especially like immediately following World War II that would have been like a pretty raw memory and in this case it's kind of a carryover from that kind of mentality
Mm-hmm.
um, but on a more universal level, there does tend to be at least one weirdo in any neighborhood that the kids are like they make up stories about, and look no further than like Home Alone, for the old man who supposedly is a killer, and of course he's nothing like that, but children's imaginations will weave all kinds of
Oh yeah, and
backstory.
it's it is a trope. I was just speaking to how even like characters that don't necessarily have that much to do throughout the entire movie, like everybody gets some additional layer of development.
Hmm.
Whether like it's just like a quick subtle moment like that where you have to kind of intuit everything from like that one moment, or maybe we get like a couple minutes of like the parents like fighting and we kind of see like what they're going through. So there is more to the writing in this than it seems at a glance, was I guess the point I was trying to drive home, which
Yeah. Well, and I mean that is good writing when you're talking about an ensemble piece like this. It's also not ever going to be a character study because it's not meant to be that, but within those confines, I think this does what it needs to do in terms of characters.
you believe these people exist and
Yeah.
like how they would react to situations.
So, Jake, what were you saying?
Well, as far as character, and again, I agree that was a pretty effective little scene, and the whole thing with the parents' divorce and whatever did add some level of layer there. I liked as far as the characters of the monsters, though. I think it'd be interesting to talk about some of those.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
Particularly Frankenstein's monster, I thought was a very cool character.
That was played by Tom Noonan,
Yeah,
which
that
if
was one of the cool parts. Tom Noonan has been in a lot of good stuff over the years.
he was
This
in Manhunter,
what's
as,
that? What's
as
that?
he was in the Manhunter.
Yeah, I was going to say this would have been the year after Manhunter or 2 years later. I don't remember. Where he played, of course, Francis Dolarhyde in that film, and he did a great job. But he usually plays villains, often very creepy characters. So it was really neat seeing them play a character that you would think they'd be really afraid of, and he bonds with the little girl, and they're like best buds. And I
Mhm.
love the way they did that.
That was so cute. Like that was such a highlight.
Well, the just for reference, so in James Whale's Frankenstein from 1931, you had the famous scene where the monster bonds with the little girl and accidentally drowns her, and that's a pretty big emotional focal point of his character there. And here they do allude to that, but they go the opposite direction
He's
where
learned his lesson this time.
where he makes friends with her. And I'll just also be honest. James Whale's Frankenstein is of course a classic and iconic and all that stuff. As a fan of Frankenstein the novel, I've never been a fan of the monosyllabic, single word monster, which is what everyone knows, because the monster in the novel starts off that way, but he becomes a like genius level, and very well spoken, beautifully spoken. He has that kind of intellect. But as far as the more single word Frankenstein's monster goes, I think this was one of the better ones, that wasn't Boris Karloff, but
I think
he was able to speak more frequently than other ones I've seen, and was able to
bogus,
emote.
bogus. I have
Yeah,
to,
and it did fit the overall spirit of the movie. Go ahead.
another reason I think why it worked for me, the more upbeat spin on the character, is I've seen the old Frankenstein, and I think I've seen a few of the sequels. But I actually am more familiar with Young Frankenstein. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
familiar with that take on the character, which is a slightly more articulate, take on the character. And his interaction with the little girl was, of course, played for laughs. He accidentally threw her in the window into her bed, but it was still a more upbeat spin than the original. So for me, this was probably more reminded me of that, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Well, and Young Frankenstein is actually more, despite it being a comedy, it's more stylistically and story wise, it's still more in line with the original timeline of the Universal ones, than you would necessarily think, even though it is 20th Century Fox and it's a comedy, but it doesn't have to stray that far, to make its points, which is cool. If we're talking monsters, I think, well, having Dracula as the leader makes perfect sense because he's easily the smartest and most powerful. Um, I think that despite him not being Transylvanian in his accent, um, and not really that much to look at
Mhm.
in terms of like what other versions I've seen. I think the actor they got did a fairly good job of being menacing. It was pretty funny in the end when he's just plowing through the police, almost like he's a Terminator.
Mhm.
That was pretty funny. But had it and just for the audience's sake, we have Dracula, Frankenstein's monster. We got a mummy, we got a werewolf, or a wolf man, but I don't know if they say wolf man a few
Well,
times, but
one
they got
thing,
that, and we got a gill man.
one thing I'd like say about characters, the Mummy. I liked that part where, and if you don't know what kind of vehicle that the German and the monster squad were actually riding around in, that is actually a duck. I don't know if it's from um, the Wisconsin Dells Ducks or the Boston Ducks, but that was an actual duck. If you know what that is, that's like a half boat, half car kind of a vehicle. So,
I thought it looked kind of weird.
Yeah.
but
Um,
I liked that part where he kind of became unraveled.
yeah,
Oh,
which
so
I did actually. Now that you mentioned that, I have two little points on that. One of which is yes, that was really cool. The
well, the mummy doesn't really do a whole lot in here besides be kind of menacing in a few scenes. Um,
Yeah.
So, I mean, early on, I just wanted to kind of touch on this real quick. So, early on, we get a lot of the kids like talking monsters. It's like, oh, well, how would you beat, the Wolfman? How would you do this? Does this work? I thought that was pretty great, like how they dealt with the mummy. And I'll let you go into it, Dane.
Yeah, it's the fact that they unravel him and what's underneath there without something to hold it together is just dust, and I think that was pretty neat because they're going for the later versions of the Mummy, not the original film with Boris Karloff, but the ones that came after, where the Mummy is always bandaged. Because in the original, he's bandaged for a bit, and then he bandaged and stays unbandaged for the rest of the movie. But the I think that was cool. The one thing that I was a little iffy on was the fact that the dynamite does not kill a werewolf, and because it wasn't made of silver and only a silver bullet can kill a werewolf, I guess. Um, the fact that getting blown to pieces doesn't do the job. It's like, and I get it. Werewolf lore was around before explosives were readily available to the general public in some form or other. But I'm pretty sure, even if it was a werewolf or Dracula or whatever, if you blow it up, I'm pretty sure that it's going to stay dead, but.
Well, I thought that was a nice touch. Like, I was kind of happy they did that. And it's like, guess that doesn't work.
Well,
Like they had fun with that stuff.
Yeah, they did. It just and it's a werewolf. It's an imaginary creature. You can do whatever you want with it. It's your prerogative.
That's one of the coolest scenes, I think, that you just kind of dismiss a little bit too readily.
As an effect scene, it's great. It just that's just to me personally. But again, it's with werewolf stuff or any of this stuff, you can really just do whatever you want. So they did it.
Yeah, it made me think of. So I don't know if anybody's ever seen Aqua Teen Hunger Force, but it made me think of. There's an episode where they find a mummy in their attic, and they just like do whatever the mummy wants because it keeps threatening to curse them. And then they like find a book that talks about the curse of the mummy is just that it's really demanding and like hard to take care of. And they literally tie it up and like put it out like in the trash can on the curb. And my friend felt that was hilarious. It's like, what's the curse of the mummy? He's really annoying. How do you get rid of him? Throw him away.
That's like why it's genuinely hard to master Excalibur, according to Soul Eater. I love that. But I like the part where they were talking about how to kill the creatures, and they all insisted there were two ways to kill a werewolf, but they couldn't think what the second one was. They couldn't agree on it. And it was like, he's like, well, what's the second one? And they all give a different answer. It's like,
well, I thought it was Wolfsbane.
Well, that was the payoff for that when blowing it up didn't work.
Yeah. The other one,
that was the whole point of that.
The other one, and I've thought about this, is just like vampires, werewolves eventually had a alpha, and so they're in along with those werewolf tropes in order to turn yourself back into to human form or a human, you were supposed to eat the heart of the alpha that bit you.
Interesting.
That's totally new to me. Never heard of that.
It is a trope.
The one thing that I, just for reference also, in the Universal monster canon, my favorite was always the Gill Man from Creature from the Black Lagoon. And the Gill Man is in here. Unfortunately, it doesn't get a whole lot to do, which is too bad because they do pretty faithfully recreate him without copying.
Yeah, he's basically just a goon in this.
Yeah, and it's too bad. It's too bad. It's too bad because in Creature from the Black Lagoon, he's very, very smart and cunning. But again, he's on his home turf, so it makes sense. But yeah, I was a little sad about that, but that's just because I'm a fan of the Gill Man.
Well, I am too, and I thought I thought it was almost kind of funny, like how they had to put in so much work to kill some of the other monsters, and the Gilman's like, rah, and they just blast him, and that's it.
Yeah. Well, and he's not, because he's not super powered, and that's why. You know, if our heroes in Creature from the Black Lagoon had been better equipped, they would have
Well,
killed him pretty quickly because he's just a creature. That's it.
technically, the Gill Man in the original Universal films, he always went after the leading lady. So when he didn't go after one of the leading ladies here, that was kind of strange too.
Well, we didn't necessarily have leading ladies.
Well, we had our little
like
girl, but that's not quite the same
a 5-year-old girl, which you
know. I would hardly use that adjective.
The creature has some principles, which is good.
I was gonna say, well, and Frankenstein was already, you know, using her for friendship purposes, but
and as they so astutely pointed out, she was a virgin.
Yep. Yeah, she was. Which, and I'm okay. Just little kind of sort of gripe there. Kind of sort of. One thing about that is that they automatically go to the beautiful high school girl to ask that question because they automatically assume that virgin has to mean a beautiful female. But virgin is just someone who hasn't had sex. And so therefore it could have been one of the kids. It could have been, you know, and I mean, if he could teach enough German to like kind of sort of get it right for the little girl, then one of the other kids could have done it. You know, it just and I get that there's a gag there, obviously, that
the way it was kind of set up, it sort of implied that it did have to be a woman. They just didn't like say it out loud because we get a flashback in the beginning where Van Helsing tries the same ritual to banish Dracula, and they have like this teen girl from the village do it. So it kind of implied to me that it had to be like that a woman had to be the one to read the chant.
And yet, on the other hand, when it didn't work with the high school girl, the first one they thought of was the German guy. And I did think that was kind of funny, though. There was like, well, he's probably not.
But that one joke, just Steve, but he doesn't count.
Yeah. Talking about the weaknesses of the monsters real quick. One, and this gets back to the whole idea of some unfortunate language in the film. There's the kid Horace, who is known by everyone as Fat Kid for the whole movie. But he did have one great moment where they encounter Dracula, and he has this, like, you see the light bulb go off, and he goes through his pockets and pulls out a piece of pizza and pushes it on Dracula's face. I was like, yep, he would have a random piece of garlic pizza. That would.
I like how that like totally fucks Dracula up.
Well,
like,
yeah.
The surprise on his face. He's like, "Oh, what the hell is that?"
Which, you know, I mean, that's good that they were. That's probably the thing I was happiest about is not only did they manage to faithfully recreate the look and feel of the Universal monsters without copying it exactly, because it's not a Universal film. Not only that, but they were true to the lore of each of the monsters, and that's why, again, some of them were much harder to kill than others. Anything else on characterization? I mean, plot is kind of more or less straightforward, so there's not too much to talk about. But you know,
one thing. Again, on the monsters and the ones, they weren't all like blanket evil in step with Dracula. You had the Wolfman when he was human was trying to protect people, was trying to be good. And yeah, he kind of went about it all wrong, going into a jail or a police station and raising holy hell. But it was, this kind of feeds into the whole thing of how out of touch with the reality on the ground that the adults were. Because like you have this guy who says he's a danger, who says he's going to cause trouble, who is causing trouble in the police station, and they wouldn't lock him up. They decided to treat him like a cornered animal instead of just locking him up. And I'm like, what the heck, you know?
Well, they did that with Tommy Jarvis, no problem, in Friday the 13th Part 6, you know. And he wasn't a werewolf, but anyway, trying to think. Yeah, plot's rather straightforward. There's the big plot device though, the MacGuffin, I think is one thing worth talking about is the amulet. I think that's one of the more unique things that the movie introduces that is not present in any of the Universal monster films. But there does tend to need to be some kind of world-ending device, especially in movies nowadays that the heroes and villains are looking for, which that is something that you do see in this film is some conventions that have only gotten more and more realized with cinema as movies have gone on in terms of structure. How did we feel about the amulet?
I thought it was kind of, well, you had to have some way to like defeat like all the monsters like at once. Like there had to be something kind of tying everything together, and I thought that was pretty good too. Plus, it went back to sort of the old, Dracula versus Van Helsing thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, it is. It was more. It's kind of hard to describe because I mean, it's a plot device that you kind of need. But that did put like an extra twist on it that there's this thing that can just like beat Dracula forever. That
Well, and
doesn't usually
evil
appear in the
forever.
mythology.
And
And it kind
I
of tied
mean,
into Van Helsing too.
It does
yeah,
it does raise some logistical issues though, and some narrative issues. If you're trying to you create a device that destroys all evil, then why did it affect the creature? Since he was shown to be very good. Why was it, if it's all monsters, then that's unfair to monsters in general. It seems, again, kind of a blanket, all monsters are bad by nature sort of thing. Um,
mm-hmm.
you had, of course, the whole thing of just random stuff getting sucked in, fences and all that kind of stuff. And
Yeah,
I
it,
guess it
it
looks
opens a
more,
black hole.
yeah, but it's like, so why was this fence was bad and this car was bad? Is that what it? Yeah.
Yeah, that was a little convenient. I mean, in
It's a
terms of
black
writing,
hole.
well, in terms of writing, the script itself is well structured and the dialogue is snappy, and you can definitely tell that Shane Black is relying on his Lethal Weapon action movie one-liners to fuel a lot of the dialogue there. Um,
Hilarious though, if any one of the kids at any point in the film had said, "I'm getting too old for this shit."
yeah,
That
not they're a little too young for that, but
would have
still,
been great, honestly.
yeah, but you can definitely tell that that kind of thought process is in there. Plus, you can just count all the movies since this time. Well, it was before this, but especially since of the thing that can stop all the monsters or all the enemies all at once. Yeah, and that whole trope has been beaten to death, quite a number of times, even in good movies. But
I like that one of the plot things is that every 100 years, this evil is supposed to like
The window.
and be the window for this band of freedom fighters to
well,
to against
yeah,
evil.
the whole theory there is kind of the same as in in studies of the paranormal, Halloween and a couple other days are supposed to be where the barriers between the spirit world and the physical world are at their weakest. So the idea being that there's always ebb and flow of spiritual, physical, good and evil. Which is I always think that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, and Amityville horror. It's 3:15 in the morning. For most people, midnight is the witching hour. So it all
Hmm.
depends on what is the window of opportunity.
Absolutely. Did you have a favorite monster or a favorite aspect of the plot or writing there, Katie?
I really don't have anything to add that hasn't already been added. I think my favorite monster is probably Frankenstein's monster, just because I really did like his relationship with the little girl and his little bogus one-liner. Like, he was a lot of fun, so I really enjoyed him.
And there were so many cute moments with them too, you know, like they're
Yes.
having like the little tea party, or like when he gets sucked into the hole, like she tosses him scraps, like the stuffed animal, so that he's not alone. Like I teared up a little bit at that.
Yeah. Well,
And
interestingly enough, Frankenstein's monster with sunglasses on, in 1993, at least three, might have been sometime after that, but there's an SNES game, The Adventures of Dr. Franken, where a Frankenstein's monster character has sunglasses on because it was the 90s and you got to make Frankenstein's monster cool for the kids, you know. But
Well, in the '90s, there was a game for the frickin' 7-Up mascot with the
that's
sunglasses.
right.
There was a computer game based on Frankenstein with Tim Curry. So
I
That's
have
right.
that somewhere. I've never like actually played it, but I've got it. So there was all kinds of weird stuff in the '90s.
And the 80s too. I mean, both of those, anything was up for grabs, but trying to think of anything else plot wise. I mean, it moves pretty efficiently. There's not a whole lot that's extraneous or anything that's too like logically problematic other than what we've discussed.
There's so many like great single scenes too.
There are.
My favorite scene would probably be where the one youngest kid in the group, at least before Phoebe brought the monster in and became part of it, when the mummy came to his house and his father came in and was like, okay, well, let's see where these monsters are, and then he goes to the closet and he's like right fucking there, and the father doesn't even realize it.
Yeah, that was I like that father character a lot. It was a shame that he was only in one scene because he was really funny and
Mommy came in my house.
Yeah, well, I thought he was really
your mother and I.
he was really funny because he I mean, that was kind of a scene stealing moment there just because he's like he's not yelling at the kid at all, which is good, but he's also not happy about having to be doing this stuff, you know. So that was a way to do a scene like that I'd never seen before, which was nice. Because he could have just yelled at the kid, but he didn't. He kind of played along with it, but also was impatient. So it's like, look at that. That's nice.
If you remember in the 2018 Halloween, there's a scene sort of similar to that with the babysitter. And
yeah, I thought about that right away. Like, I wonder if they got the idea for that from this. I mean, because it's such like a hugely influential work on so many people that write or create horror.
Well, and as the ball bounces, as I've said before, now that people in horror these days grew up with the Monster Squad, then inevitably elements of it pop up in horror works that you'd see nowadays, like you just mentioned. And obviously the people, the Duffer Brothers who did Stranger Things, they've obviously seen this because a lot of familiar dynamics there. So it just art influences itself, and they usually goes in 30-year cycles.
Yeah, and don't forget too, like all of the quotes that this movie gets from it too. Like one thing you'll see a lot is like the main kid's shirt, like Stephen King rules. Like that's all over the place.
Yeah, fat kid farted. Wolfman's got nards.
Yeah, well, that was a fun scene too. Like calling back to like their talks about the monsters. It's like, does Wolfman have nards? And it's like a ridiculous like debate like kids would have. Then they get attacked by the Wolfman. Kick him in the nards, but it doesn't have nards. Do it! Wow! Wolfman goes down. It's like, hey, it works.
I think I've made a documentary with that name.
There were so many fun moments like that.
And then the kid has the great one line, "Creature got my Twinkie."
I know that was my favorite one, just because, well, it was the Gill Man is my favorite. Number one, and number two, it was one that I haven't heard so many times to death. Because again, like anything that's quoted can be over quoted, into oblivion. And luckily I hadn't heard that one before. So I was like, good, that's nice. And of course, anytime you can mention a Twinkie in a movie, that's just comic gold right there.
That's a big Twinkie.
That's right.
Big
Trying to
Twinkie
think.
energy.
Do we have any favorite effects, or because I mean we're talking about scenes?
My favorite effect, even though I know it was so out of whack, and the werewolf tropes, or when the werewolf was blown up, how they used shadows to put him back together.
Yeah, that was neat. I did think it was funny when he actually did get blown up. The fact that he blows up almost like a sack of flour.
I think it's important for us to mention that the effects were done by Stan Winston.
Yes.
Oh shit! No wonder they were so good.
Effects artist, yes, and he actually modeled the Wolfman after his own face. Which is why the Wolfman looks like a Stan Winston man.
Well, it's kind of like how Yoda was designed after his designer as well. So, I mean, it's interesting the creation reflects the creator. Much like how Frankenstein's monster reflects Frankenstein himself. But I think probably the least unique design was probably Dracula himself. But again, they're not really going for anything too unique because it is homage and pastiche after all. But
as far as Dracula,
Dracula was pretty good.
As far as Dracula being menacing, I was not an entire fan of him as Dracula.
I mean, he's not at all the best. I mean, he's no Bela Lugosi or Christopher Lee. He's not
theatrical. It's just it seemed like he was like somebody's father who just threw on some makeup and some fluffy cape and decided to run around as Dracula.
Dracula is a difficult role just because you have to have presence and charisma, and you have to really command
a lot.
Well, you have to command a room in a way that very few people can. I mean, Bela Lugosi could do it. Christopher Lee could do it. Gary Oldman could really do it. There's a lot of great actors that can. It's just that is difficult. And again, it is an ensemble piece. So, I mean, Dracula's not the main focus, and it'd be difficult to do that. But yeah, I mean, he wasn't my favorite Dracula ever, but he wasn't, bad per se. But
I thought he was a pretty good Dracula. So plus, you kind of had to you had to kind of have a balancing act between, he's Dracula. He does all the things that you mentioned. Command the room. Be intimidating. But you have to also be able to believe that like a group of kids could beat this particular Dracula.
Yeah.
So I thought they did a very good job of like balancing that act out.
So that's a fair point.
So and like how he constantly was like, they can't do anything to me, and then they just kept like proving him wrong.
You were gonna say something, Jake?
Oh, I said, yeah, they couldn't beat Gary Oldman.
No,
they did have one good moment for him, or I thought it was a fun moment, where he decided to blow up their clubhouse, and then he says, I think it was meeting adjourned or whatever it was.
Yeah, he throws some dynamite in there, and he's like, meeting adjourned.
It was pretty good.
Well, that is one thing that this Dracula has over the others, is that what he lacks in presence and menace, he makes up for in one-liners and in explosives, and the fact that he has a car that can disappear, and he, whatever he throws, that energy ball or whatever.
That hearse is badass.
Yes, it is.
It goes through the fucking police car. That's what it does.
I was kind of though, because the hearse goes right through the cop car, and then he plows down a fence. And he's like, was he selectively intangible and he just didn't like that fence? Or
the magic hearse. Give it a... You can do it at once.
He's probably got an invisible button somewhere. But, I think what's interesting... I think it's interesting whenever you have Dracula that can use energy projectiles, which is not often, but he could do that here, and he could do it in Dracula versus Frankenstein.
There was...
Go ahead.
One other cool moment with Dracula where he was standing, and all of a sudden his face turned into a skull for just barely a few seconds.
just like a flash in the lightning. That was cool.
Yeah.
Mhm. And I liked seeing him surrounded by electricity, which you don't ever see. That's if you see that at all, it's almost always Frankenstein's monster for obvious reasons. Um, but yeah, that was a cool visual.
Yeah, Dragon Ball Dracula was kind of cool. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and he did a Hadouken, more or less the American equivalent of it. But I'm trying to think anything else that we haven't touched on.
Well, one thing I do want to mention for real quick, because it was the thing that caught my attention the most. It was just the people attached again, Stan Winston, Tom Noonan were big ones. It's interesting that most of the kids fell out of acting for the better part of a decade and are now coming back to it. So it's kind of interesting, like one of the most notable roles that the girl had was a role in Frasier, and I actually remember that episode very well. But the biggest one, of course, being Shane Black. We already mentioned that he wrote Lethal Weapon, but he went on to he is building a name for himself as a director. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, Iron Man 3, The Nice Guys, those were all some pretty good movies. So I just think that was definitely one person that is moving up in the world, if you will.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to add something to that too. So he also did him and Dekker too. I think they did this year's The Predator. Which did anybody else see that?
Yeah,
It kind of felt his version of The Predator felt an awful lot like the Monster Squad to me, which I really enjoyed, but a lot of people didn't respond very well to, which was kind of strange. Because it kind of felt like a mashup of like the Monster Squad kids, fight the Predator. It's just they're adults this time, and a lot of them die. So
what would be cool is if the kids from Monster Squad would have grown up to join the Ghostbusters eventually when they got old enough.
Maybe they're in the new one that's coming out.
That'd be cool. Trying to think. Oh yeah, I had one more thing. So our monster lineup, I noticed, since it is such an homage to the Universal monster films, our lineup was Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, Gillman, Wolfman, and a mummy. What we're missing Bride of Frankenstein, we're missing the Invisible Man, and we're missing the Phantom of the Opera. But Invisible Man and Phantom of the Opera, they're just guys; they don't have any powers. And then Bride of Frankenstein, I don't think he could have really fit into this. But we did get Brides of Dracula, which was nice because they don't get enough credit for doing what they do.
Yeah,
yeah.
That's kind of worth pointing out too, because the first time I saw this, like the scene where he creates the brides from like those kidnapped girls, like that kind of bothered me a little bit when I first saw it when I was like younger. But it wasn't like a thing this time because it's like, oh yeah, well.
Well, yeah, I mean, as we established from Let the Right One In, there's always at least one either vampire slave or in this case vampire bride, which is not necessarily the same thing, but there's pretty much always at least one. And then there's three in this case, which is proper for Dracula because the novel he has three and the most movie adaptations he has three. Let's see. Anything else?
I wish I could remember his name. Like the older kid really carried a lot of the weight, like in the finale, because doesn't he? It kills like four. He kills like four or so of the creatures like himself, like, and arguably is most responsible for stopping the mummy too.
And you can see he's like fucked up by it too.
Yeah,
it's like taking its toll on him.
And it makes sense why, because he is the oldest after all, and I mean he's got the most agency in the situation and the most capacity to affect the situation, which is not unlike what happens in Stranger Things. Same kind of thing. The older kids have the capacity to actually do more of the necessary saving of the day. The kids do all the discovering and all the hard work, but you know, the older kids and the adults ultimately have to do the saving the day stuff. Um, but yeah, if nobody else has anything else, I think we did a pretty thorough job of covering this thing. It's a good movie. It's
The only
definitely one to check out.
the only other thing that I thought I should mention is the puppy in the movie, because I remember when they said when they were gathered together and called themselves the Squad, his paw ended up being over the other hand. So I was like, that is fucking cool.
Well, that
Oh
was
yeah,
fu-
and
that was
the line too. It's like, how does the dog get up here?
that was funny. I like those kind of self-aware lines that don't break the overall mood of the movie, but I mean, I would be thinking the same thing too.
I did have
Go ahead.
one quick thing with that too. So there were a handful of like little things in here that kind of reminded me of like kind of my childhood too. And like I had a beagle that was kind of like that. It didn't like follow us everywhere, but it reminded me of my childhood dog a little bit. And
Aw.
plus, there's a scene where like his dad's a cop, and his dad gets called away to go investigate like the disappearance of the mummy, uh, and it kind of ruins everybody's night. And so he's sitting up on his roof. The kid's sitting up on his roof, like watching a drive-in movie through binoculars. And his dad joins him, and like his dad went and got Burger King, and he's like, "What I miss?" And they just kind of hang out on the roof and like share some fast food. And we didn't really have a roof that I could do stuff like that on. But after like a rough day or whatever, usually my dad would bring me like McDonald's or something just like that, and we just kind of like sit down and do that sometimes. So that was kind of a nice memory that
Yeah.
I had long forgotten about that sort of trip. And I was like, oh yeah, yeah.
Which, I mean, in most of these movies that are about, a group of boys getting together and solving a mystery and doing that kind of stuff, like that was not my childhood because I was homeschooled and was at home a lot and I didn't really have any real friends and that sort of stuff. So I can never really relate to that part of it. But then the big point of difference here is that these kids had grown up with the same movies that I had, and that was nice to see for a change. I do feel a little bit sad for kids nowadays that more than likely they're not going to grow up with the classics um, the way that I feel like they should. But you know, maybe through one of these, maybe they can stumble across it one day. I hope so because I want those to stay alive.
Oh, most definitely. I think this was a great send up to like the Universal monsters of the 50s and 60s. Just
Yeah,
a lot of people think that 80s films are like nostalgic, and
Well, they are.
they are for our current generation, and the classic monster films are nostalgic for the people that wrote this movie clearly, and it just keeps building on itself. As time goes along, I just don't want the old stuff to die out.
I
Because
don't think you have
it's
to worry about that, at least not within the
Yeah,
horror community, because the
yeah,
classic
exactly.
monsters are very much kept alive within the horror community.
and that's important because I mean that no matter what movie gets remade or gets whatever happens to it or whatever new franchise comes along, I mean we can hopefully have the old classics as the bedrock just because I mean they are the gold standard for a reason, and just always want to make sure people remember that. um and that's why I wanted to host tonight. So yes, thank you very much everyone for listening, and we might as well, if no one else has anything, we might as well say what
Uh,
everyone is all
there
about.
there was one more joke I liked. So they're in the abandoned house that Dracula is keeping the amulet in, and they're like cornered by the Wolfman, the Broads, and Dracula. Like they're up against like a statue, like in a hallway, and it's like, quick, look for a switch. It's like, what are you talking about? It's like, don't you read the Hardy Boys? Like, there's always a secret passage. That's stupid. And they just like start pulling on the statue, and they like open a trapdoor and escape. And I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, there's a bit of good self-aware dialogue like that. Helps cover up what would otherwise be a convenient, writing aspect of convenient writing.
To be fair, we do see Dracula use the statue like a couple of times first.
Yeah, we do. And that house has secret compartments and all that. And of course, the house number is 666. It has to be, of course. And they even do. Oh yeah, one tiny thing. They even do the Alucard is Dracula spelled backwards thing in this, which they didn't even really need, but it is nice that they at least knew about that, because that originated in Son of Dracula.
And that was cool that the kid sat down and wrote it out like he had pulled out his Orphan Annie ring, to figure out, oh damn, that spells Dracula.
I thought it was like, I saw it and I was like, wait, oh shit.
And I'm sure that not a lot of people know where that came from, but the writers of the movie clearly did, and they paid a good amount of homage to it. All right, so I think I'm going to wrap this up. So who wants to go first?
Okay, I guess I'll go first. I am Katie Cadaver from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm a body positive horror artist and alternative model. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Patreon, Twitter, and I'm also the makeup artist for horror punk band Rap at Spider. You can find Rap at Spider on Bandcamp. And you can find me this weekend in Cincinnati, Ohio for Horror Hound. I will be with Trauma Entertainment. And so stop by and see me. I'm doing a new cosplay this weekend that I'm really excited about. And then I will be next Friday at C2E2 in Chicago. You can come out and see me there with Trauma again, and also with the lovely Lloyd Kaufman. So come out and get your autograph from Lloyd Kaufman and hang out with us. So that's pretty much what's on my agenda for the next couple weeks and where you can find me.
Anybody that's going to Cincinnati, be very careful. If you have any kind of outdoor allergies whatsoever, that's a very low pressure city. And if you're anything like me, as soon as you're in there, you're going to feel really sick. And that's why, because it's a bad allergy town. And Jake, you want to go for it?
Sure. My name's Jake. I'm here in Central Virginia, and unfortunately a little under the weather this week, but could be better, could be worse. I frequently guest on YouTube channel Septum Sin versus the World, and since Septum's not here tonight, I'll go ahead and say it's a channel dedicated to social media and all of its forms. We do reviews, pickup videos, top 15s. We recently did top 15 movies that were nominated for Oscar but did not win a thing, and some of those are very surprising. And we unfortunately had to take this week off, because of illness. But I also have my own channel, Kotobuki Jake, which is dedicated to nature and the natural world. And and that's I'm sorry.
And Jake dies.
Dustin?
Oh, maybe he did die. Crap. Well, I'm known on Twitter and YouTube as the Crypt of Horrors, where I show off my vast horror collection. So I'm a horror collector here in Milwaukee. I have an Instagram, DHR Hunter, which I'll probably upgrade to the Crypt of Horrors as well fairly soon, just to kind of keep the theme going. I am a frequent panelist on here, and I'm also on Pop Culture Weekly, also here on YouTube. with the organizers of the Twisted Dreams Film Fest. So go check us and that out, and come to the festival to see Bob Briggs, who's awesome. It's more or less about what I do. So
Sweet. And I'll get Save David for last so we can sign us off. But I am Dan Kyle, hosted tonight. I'm an independent filmmaker out of Charlotte, North Carolina, and I've got segments of anthology feature films. I've got like at least 5 or 6 now. I just finished shooting one. Gonna be starting to write another one, which is just really quick back to back. I'm amazed at how quickly these come to my attention, but one of them is Grindsploitation 7, Clownsploitation, which is on Troma right now, and will be, I think, getting a Blu-ray release along with Grindsploitation 4, 5, and 6, so that's cool. And then I've got other ones that'll be coming out later on this year, and there's always something wacky going on, not to mention the fact that the teaser trailer for Asylum Origins Harley, my girlfriend's web series that I directed, that dropped not too long ago. So stay tuned for that. This August is when we're set to debut it. And David can wrap us up.
Alrighty, and my name is David Streggy. I'm a producer from here in Milwaukee, as well as the main host of Inside Movies Galore. But as you well know, we all host the show. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for listening. And on the same channel that we have been broadcasting on, I do reviews, but I will be switching all that over to my new channel, Delusions of Grandeur. So a little bit of news. I have begun producing a couple of films for David Sterling, which are coming out. One of them is in April, Camp Blood Kills. So stay tuned for that film, as well as Camp Blood 9. So keep informed when that'll come out, and keep checking out some of the reviews that I have out. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully you have a great evening, and everyone's good night.
Good night.
Like, share, and subscribe.
Bogus.